Number 10. Rancid odors. A picture may say 1,000 words, but it cannot convey the acrid odors of the Old West. Back then, personal hygiene habits were definitely not what they are today. For one thing, bathing, brushing your teeth, washing your hair, and other healthy habits took place far less often. As writer Meg Mims points out on her blog, Cowboy Kisses, shampoo wasn't even invented until the late 1800s. Women were relegated to using plain soap to wash their hair, and that only occurred once a month or so. Most good time girls kept a basin in their rooms, since cleanliness was important to both them and their customers. Deodorant and toothpaste were rare too, according to Elena Sandage. Toothpaste wasn't available in a tube until 1892, and deodorant wasn't invented until 1888. Most folks just had to make do with sticky pits and privates. There was makeup, which was basically taboo among proper women, but used by actresses, saloon girls, and prostitutes. Author Sylvia McDaniel verifies that these women used small pots containing carminic acid and aluminum or calcium salts to color their cheeks and lips. They also used hair dye. Outside of their realm, however, shady ladies wore only enough cosmetics, like face powder, to make their skin appear as beautiful and natural as possible. But not until after 1900, according to the Old Farmer's Almanac, did manufactured eyebrow pencils, eyeshadow, face powder, and lipstick become all the rage. Number 9. Scandalous outfits. Saloon girls wore brightly colored ruffled skirts that were scandalously short for the time, mid-shin or knee-length. Under the bell-shaped skirts could be seen colorfully hued petticoats that barely reached their kid boots that were often adorned with tassels. More often than not, their arms and shoulders were bare, their bodices cut low over their bosoms, and their dresses decorated with sequins and fringe. Silk, lace, or net stockings were held up by garters, which were often gifts from their admirers. The term painted ladies was coined because the girls had the audacity to wear makeup and dye their hair. Traditional women of the East wore completely different clothing than saloon girls. The differences in styles of women's clothing are enough to make it a metaphor for changing societal and gender norms. The many components that make up a Victorian-style dress are representative of the countless rules that limited women's rights in the East. The restriction of movement due to these dresses is evocative of what little control women had over their lives. Eastern women's roles were minimal. They revolved around domestic work, while men held more prominent, laborious jobs. Women were not allowed to own property, make their own money, or vote. To men, women did not embody the strength or worth that they did. Saloon girls shed these Eastern rules and Victorian ways of dressing. Their scandalous, revealing outfits can be seen as rebelling against the nature of Eastern values and dressage. Saloon girls wore clothes that allowed for free movement, absent of constraints. This can be interpreted as a newly created sense of independence. In other words, some of the rules that restricted women in the East were no longer in existence in the West. Women were thought of as exhibiting more than just domestic qualities in Western society. Saloon girls were now making their own money independently of men, owning land in their own name, and dressing in more expressive clothing. In short, women of the East dressed in a way that symbolized their repressed freedom. But the clothing that saloon girls wore depicted a breaking down of previous societal norms and the adoption of independence. Number 8. Everything was legal. In the Old West, it was up to individual jurisdictions to decide whether or not houses of ill repute were legal or not. According to some historians, the practice was widely accepted. Madams simply needed licenses to run their enterprises. The money from the licensing ensured the city profited. Some historians have noted that bordellos were compelled to pay fines to local governments in order to stay in business. These fines were usually about $8 per month. Many authority figures seemingly chose to overlook these establishments because they supported the local economy. During the 19th century, when the Wild West was in its heyday, there were areas where prostitution was tolerated and even regulated, while in other places it was strictly prohibited. In some frontier towns, particularly those that sprung up around mining camps and railroad construction sites, There was often a lack of law enforcement and a more permissible attitude towards various activities, including prostitution. In these areas, makeshift brothels and saloons might operate openly without much interference from local authorities. Number 7. A familial duty. There are probably not a lot of differences between some of the reasons why women entered the prostitution business during the Wild West and why they do so today. However, with limited opportunities in the 19th century, many had little choice when they were abandoned by their husbands or stranded in Old West towns when their spouse was killed. Some simply had no other means of providing support. Others were the daughters of prostitutes already tainted in the business. The saddest reason was that women were seduced by a cad, lost their virginity, or were raped. At the time, these women were seen as lost and there was no hope for them, virtually forcing them into prostitution. Though the proper ladies ignored the existence of brothels, realistically they admitted their necessity to distract the attention of men from pursuing their daughters and relieving them of their obligation. At the time, Victorian prudence had long taught decent women that the sexual act was solely to bear children. She was taught that she shouldn't respond in any way and that her man should be indulged from time to time, but best to be avoided whenever possible. The men of the West were often intimidated by the decent women who laid down the moral law, and found themselves much more comfortable with the painted ladies who allowed them to be who they were. Virtually every Old West town had at least a couple of shady ladies who were the source of much gossip. Sometimes she would hide behind the chore of taking in the laundry as a seamstress, or running a boarding house. But often she would flaunt her profitable bordello by prancing through the streets in her fine clothing, much to the chagrin of the proper women of the town. Such was the case of Pearl DeVere of Cripple Creek, Colorado. By the 1860s, prostitution was a booming business. Though it was illegal almost everywhere, it was impossible to suppress, so the law generally did little more than to try and confine the parlors and brothels to certain districts of the community. Others regularly fined the brothels and painted ladies as a type of taxation. But otherwise, the businesses thrived with little intervention from the law. Shady ladies were so numerous in some frontier towns that some historians have estimated they made up 25% of the population, often outnumbering the decent women 25 to 1. As the Old West towns grew, they often had several bordellos staffed by 4 or 5 women. Usually, painted ladies were between the ages of 14 and 30, with an average age of 23. Number 6. America's oldest profession was in full swing. The Old West undeniably featured sex workers as an integral part of any town or city. It's intriguing, however, that there were so many different options available across the region that offered something for everyone. While some places adhered to the stereotypical portrayal of this work, others held it in higher esteem, providing expansive and elaborate spaces for these workers to operate. Sex work in the Old West was also indicative of socioeconomic classes in society during that time. Many of these workers were young, typically under 30, with limited education and often unable to read or write. Some were immigrants, and pricing for their services was influenced not only by their physical appearance, but also by their nationality and ethnicity. Similar to the anonymous and easily replaceable miners and railroad workers of the American frontier, these workers served a social and economic role driven by the demands of capitalism. However, as individuals, they were often overlooked and forgotten by society.